In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello and welcome to the Sublation Magazine show. It's I, Douglas Lane. I'm the host of the podcast here, but also the new editor of Sublation Magazine. So we are just now launching this again today, and I wanted to direct people to the magazine. It looks like we have no one watching at the moment, which is making me stumble. But yeah, all right, good. I'll just say whatever I want. Also, it's the best thing that I've ever written or that any human being has ever written. It's on the Sublation Magazine website right now, and you should go check it out. We also are releasing a book this week, or actually this month, called Made in Nowhere by Alex Gwang. I'm sorry, let me get this right. I'm seeing no one's watching, so it doesn't matter. Alex Taek-Gwang Lee. He is a professor of philosophy and cultural studies and the director of the Center for Cross-Cultural Studies. His book, Made in Nowhere, is coming out this month. Here, I'll read a summary of it. Claims from Western radicals and leftists insisting that China is not a capitalist nation go hand in hand with broader claims that have gained traction since 2008 regarding capitalism itself. It is easy to believe that China isn't a capitalist nation if capitalism has been dealt a mortal blow by the mortgage crisis of 2008 and then finally perished during the pandemic. But Alex Taek-Gwang Lee asks readers to think more clearly and reminds them of how the best critic of capitalism, Karl Marx, understood capitalism to be defined by a division of labor, global distribution, and most of all, by the production of commodities. The production of commodities created by a newly emerging laboring class. So Made in Nowhere is available for pre-order now on our website. There's a link to it in the description, and you should go check that out. I'm Doug Lane, again, the author of Bash Bash Revolution, Wave of Mutilation, and right now the essay over at Sublation Magazine entitled in post-neoliberalism, Will We Be Fucking or Being Fucked? Go read that. Benjamin, introduce yourself. I'm finally through my stumbling introduction.
I'm Benjamin Studebaker, PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge, and the author of two books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
This week, we're going to be discussing China, because we have this new book coming, and also AI. And then we're going to finish it off with a discussion of Walter Kern's short story Finishing, which I think is apropos. But to start with, I just would point out that it's very difficult to get a good sense of how things are going in this new trade war with China because of a blackout on economic data from China. I just saw a Wall Street Journal report that said that economists are having a difficult time tracking how things are going because many different points of data are no longer being shared. What do you think, Ben? Can you make sense of how this trade war with China is going?
Yeah, when it comes to trying to watch China, it's very, very difficult. The quality of the information that we get is suspect, has been suspect for many years. And then oftentimes in a sensitive period, they'll pull data, they'll stop publishing data or stop sharing data. So to try to figure out what's going on by watching China is an extraordinarily difficult task, even for people who are fluent in Mandarin, have spent substantial amounts of time there. It's very, very difficult to watch China. What you can do is watch the American government to some degree and to see how it's behaving, how it's responding. And that can give you some insight perhaps into what's going on with China. But one of the things that we're seeing is that there is a kind of information war element to the trade war that is akin to the information war element that you would see, and indeed we do see, for instance, with regard to Ukraine, in a real war, which is that the different media outlets, depending on which side of the war they're on, will give different narratives of what's taking place that people will pick mainly for reasons of wanting to feel more comfortable and reassured about what's going on. So if you're someone who wants to feel like the United States is winning the trade war, there is news and articles that you could share that would make that seem to be true. And if you're someone who wants it to be the case that China is winning the trade war, there's also news and articles that you could share that would make that seem to be true. And meanwhile, both of the sides are telling different stories about whether they're interested in negotiating with each other and to what degree. So China claims that the United States is wringing it off the hook, begging it for negotiations. And the United States says it's not sure it wants to talk to China at all because of mistrust over how China handled the previous round of negotiations. These claims can't both be true at the same time. And yet they're both being made at once, and they're being believed by different parts of the population.
Well, one thing is certain, which is that China's aims in the trade war are not as far reaching as what we're being told the aims of the Trump administration are. The Trump administration appears to be wanting to rearrange the entire global trade system, the whole order, and wants to reboot and relaunch the United States as a major manufacturer in the world. That is a bigger task than what China wants to do, which is to manage its financial situation and its currency so that it is a bit less dependent on the US dollar and becomes a more independent nation and continues its trajectory, which has been one of tremendous growth for the last 15, 20 years. So it does look like, just in terms of odds, that the odds are on China to, in the short term anyway, weather the storm and meet their own expectations. Would you agree with that?
Well, there is a kind of cooperation that is occurring, not necessarily at a conscious level, not necessarily through any sort of plan or scheme, but an implicit cooperation occurring between China and a number of the major CEOs, executives at leading American companies, both of whom want to conserve the existing order. So one of the things I recently read about in the FT is the large number of big box store executives who have been on the phone with Donald Trump, have been going golfing with Donald Trump and trying to persuade him in private to back off on the tariffs or to give carve-outs for specific sectors, specific purposes. He's been having meetings from oil industry executives about a concern about oil prices and gas prices that are too low. He's been having meetings with Apple's CEO, Tim Cook, about the tariffs on phones and on computers. And these CEOs have been successful in getting him to soften his position in ways which can be helpful to China in attempting to conserve the existing system.
Right. And the other thing to keep in mind is that there's not just one plan in the Trump administration, but four, at least. There's Scott Bessent's plan, Peter Navarro's plan, Kevin Hassett's plan, and what's the last guy's name? Mirren's plan. And they're complementary but different. Moran's plan, actually, is how I should say it. So what I've heard is that some of Trump's advisors are less hawkish on the trade war, are more nuanced in their approach to imposing tariffs than others. And so if these big box store CEOs are whispering in Trump's ears, there's also going to be an advisor who might agree with them. The other thing is that the bond market is something they're keeping close tabs on. Not the stock market, but they definitely want to strengthen the dollar, and that means strengthening bonds. And so they're going to be careful around how their policies influence bond markets. I understand.
Well, they want a somewhat weaker dollar because they want to make U.S. exports more competitive. So to some degree, some falling in the dollar is potentially in alignment with what the administration is trying to do. But that has to be done carefully in a measured way. You don't want to overdo it. And so there will be concern about any kind of rapid movement that would be out of control. But some weakening of the dollar would be compatible with an attempt to boost U.S. exports. It's a very difficult thing to plan out or scheme because this kind of policy relies on predictions about how other states will respond. And it's very hard to predict the behavior of other states with the level of accuracy that you would need to predict it to know exactly how a policy like this will shake out, which is why it's an inherently very risky strategy to start a trade war with so many states all at once as players. It creates a lot of variables and a lot of things that no one person can master. No one person can know what the situation is in Indonesia, in India, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in Peru, in Chile, with the kind of forensic detail that you'd need to know to be able to predict the behavior of all of these states at once. So there is a riskiness in pulling so many states in at the same time. And yet, if you don't pull lots of states in at once, then that changes the temporal window. It changes the speed and pace with which you can potentially make the change you're looking to make. So there's always this extra risk that comes with having a time preference that's very short for something that's very complicated.
Right. And the Trump administration is not known for its professionalism. I mean, they've had 4 years to gather some competent lawyers and advisors around Trump, and they're more prepared this time around, apparently, than they were in 2017. But nonetheless, there seems to be some moments that indicate that maybe they're, shooting from the hip and not always tracking what they're doing particularly well. The tariffs
How could
on the
anybody
island
track all of it?
Yeah, that's true. But if you had a big enough team and they were well coordinated, you might be able to have a way to assess and make decisions that wouldn't put tariffs on an island full of penguins, as an example.
It's a little bit like trying to fight a real war, but with what was not previously regarded as an army.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine in a real war, you would have a bunch of different generals. They would have different strategies and tactics that they would propose. You would not want to flag all of the strategies and tactics in the media. You wouldn't want the other side to be able to see what you were up to. And you might deliberately put out fake plans in the media or try to persuade the spies that they've uncovered what is the real plan when it is in fact the fake plan. So you might do a certain amount of dummy planning. You might do that. But you're going to struggle if you have a government that is not accustomed to fighting this kind of war, that is not organized to fight this kind of war. And yet all of a sudden you're going to demand that all of these different assets, which have previously been used for other completely different purposes, be committed to this kind of struggle, which is foreign ground for all of them. The advantage for the administration is that everybody is in this boat. This kind of broad spectrum, very high tariffs from a tariff base that was very low in historic terms. In this kind of time window, it just hasn't been done. So it puts everybody in a situation that is confusing and difficult.
Michael says that the Penguin Island tariffs aren't illegitimate, and I got taken in by the lib media. I don't doubt it. Do you know anything about this?
So the case for these kinds of tariffs, as I understand it, is that sometimes in response to tariffs, islands or territories that are previously not in real economic use, you can have goods pit stop in these places as an attempt to try to get around tariffs. And we also are seeing some reporting of this in terms of China friend washing products. So China sending products to Vietnam, and then those products coming from Vietnam to the United States. And in this way, if there is a country that is a friend of the United States, but also maintaining a good relationship with China, it becomes possible for that country to wash the products.
All right, that
escaping the
happens.
tariff.
That happens all the time, actually, in a variety of ways. I think things go through Ireland for the last stage of production in order to avoid tariffs and taxation.
Yeah, which is why if
quite
you
often.
really want this to work, you have to actually make an iron curtain around China and get the friends to cut ties to a substantial degree. Ultimately, if you really want to get China out of the system, you would have to do that. If your goal is just to create a sufficiently nasty crisis that China will negotiate with you in good faith, where before you believed they were negotiating in bad faith, and your ultimate objective is just to cut a deal with China, then maybe that doesn't matter as much. And I am wondering if that might be where this goes, if really their goal here is just to get China to take the negotiations more seriously than they did during the first administration.
Well, to what degree would merely cutting a better trade deal or new trade deal with China truly achieve the aims of, let's say, over the next 5 to 10 years, significantly onshoring industry and recreating the United States as a manufacturing power again, and not and that, it seems like Trump is saying shifting us away from being a consumer-based society back into a kind of savings and producer economy.
Well, it wouldn't be a full transition in the direction that the administration has described. What it would be is a moderating of the current relationship. And this is something that could be of benefit to the Communist Party of China. The Communist Party of China has been dealing with these local authorities and construction companies that have a little bit of leverage with regard to it as a consequence of the way China has been developing and the overemphasis on production, overdependence on production that has occurred there. It could strengthen the position of the party in China to make the right kind of deal with the United States. There could be cooperation between the two states against the private actors that in both cases have an interest in preserving a very unbalanced relationship. And the two states could, if the governments in both states recognize the need for it, work together to moderate that imbalance.
Spencer Leonard says that the notion that the goal is to cut China out of international trade is absurd. And I think that maybe we misspoke, and that might be partially my fault. You weren't really indicating that you thought the aim was to completely cut China off, but rather to put enough of a barrier between China and the rest of the world that it would significantly diminish their export capacity, right? So that other producers would have to be turned to, who are actually truly the source of the production, including the United States. That's how I understood what you were saying. Is that right?
This has to be one of the possibilities. If the United States is not prepared to potentially escalate to the point at which a new Cold War would be established, then the United States doesn't have enough leverage to potentially extract what it would need to extract. So in a kind of hard case where China is using these other states to circumvent the tariffs, and there's a persistent lack of negotiation that goes on, and the tariffs are in force for a long period of time, and negotiations don't take place, and there's no deal, then we would expect to see things further escalate. And I think that there has to be some possibility that if the United States does not regard the PRC as a negotiator that it can work with, that there would be a gradual movement toward a second Cold War. If that isn't something that the administration is prepared to potentially do, then it doesn't have very much leverage and is going to lose and end up with a deal that isn't going to do very much for it.
So, so you're talking about another Iron Curtain and dividing up the world in half again, roughly.
Well, a willingness to push it that far if you're not willing to push it that far, then China won't get into a situation where it's under the kind of pressure and distress that would really compel it to negotiate in good faith. If the administration's belief is that China will only negotiate in good faith if it's subjected to an enormous amount of stress, then there has to be a willingness to persist with the enormous amount of stress long enough so as to get that to happen. And ultimately, that can only be done if the other states cooperate with the United States in applying that stress. So it would have to be the case that these friends are willing to help the United States to apply that pressure in the way that the European states helped the United States to apply pressure on the Soviet Union. So there's a question here about whether those states are really willing to do that.
Right, of course there is. But Spencer Leonard is saying here that Trump and the United States is trying to renegotiate on behalf of the world economy, which and it sounds perhaps Pollyanna to suggest such a thing. But on the other hand, as you've said, there's an element of cooperation already between even China and the United States. The fact that China doesn't really want to be in the position of backstopping the world's currencies, being the reserve currency for the world, but is happy to allow the United States some role in that capacity while maybe trying to get off the train itself, indicates to me that there's an awareness of not just the significance of the United States, but the interdependence of all these nations in a global system that would push towards cooperation at the same time. I mean, the contradictions here, but what would it be? What would the reasoning be behind the idea that China ultimately is a belligerent and doesn't see the need for cooperation or want to negotiate in good faith? If it's true that they don't want to replace the United States as a global hegemon and don't want to be the world reserve currency, don't want to have to police the seas and so on.
Well, this would be to do with the idea that China is trying to grow appendage to the world system, but it's not willing to play by the rules. So the thinking, and you can find this from both Democrats and Republicans, Hillary Clinton has said that in her view, China is not a trustworthy negotiator. What that would mean is that if you make an agreement with China, what will happen is that you will only have made an agreement with that specific diplomat that you were talking to. You take that agreement back to Beijing. Beijing changes the wording and tries to slip stuff past you so as to avoid being committed to the things that the diplomat said in the room that they were committed to. And then if accused of having done this, China will say, no, I didn't do this. You're making things up, and kind of gaslight you about the nature of what it is that you agreed to. This is the stuff that many in the first Trump administration accused China of doing. It's also something that many Democrats believe China does. So if you think that China is a kind of rogue party state that won't play by the rules, that is trying to use and abuse the rules to get ahead, then you're not able to make an agreement unless that agreement is backed up by some kind of force. So if you aren't willing to fight an actual war, then the kind of force that you could muster would be tariffs, which is why there is widespread willingness on the part of both Democrats and Republicans to consider tariffs and to not take tariffs off the table. It's a necessary tactic or tool if you think that this renegotiation has to take place. Now, if there is a persistent inability to find terms that the two sides can agree to, if the two sides are too far apart, then there could be escalation. And that wouldn't be because either side wants there to be escalation, but simply because there would be a breakdown in the ability to talk it out at the level of international diplomacy. And that happens sometimes. That's entirely possible. And it's possible even though neither side wants that to happen. They have to nonetheless be prepared for that possibility, because if you're not prepared for that possibility, then you have no leverage in the negotiations. Somebody is able to escalate it beyond a point at which you will tolerate, and that becomes clear, then the strategy is simply to escalate it past that point and then force you to comply. So both of the sides have to, at the very least, act prepared to take it as far as it might go. But of course, in practice, the two sides both would prefer to avoid that outcome. They would both prefer for the other side to cave at a reasonable and appropriate point.
Right. Spencer Leonard says that not even Trump believes in zero-sum negotiation or negotiating, and I'm assuming neither China nor the United States ever really approaches negotiating from a zero-sum perspective. But on the other hand, there is enough of a zero-sum quality to these negotiations that you can't simply cooperate and work out the best approach for both parties, that there's always going to be trade-offs.
Both of them are dealing with a significant factional base that wants to keep things as it is and will try to undermine any attempt at reform. So in both cases, I think the Chinese party state and the United States both have a real interest in making a certain amount of reform. But in both cases, there are internal factions within China and within the United States that oppose any attempt at reform and will therefore try to prevent negotiations that would result in genuine real reform. This means that not only are the two states having trouble talking to each other, they're having trouble coordinating internally with the factions that oppose the negotiations. So there's a number of different ways in which this attempt to talk it out can come undone because of intra-elite conflict, both between the state elites and intra-elite conflict among elites within both China and within the United States.
Right.
And there's the possibility of public opinion coming off the rails and that having further political effects.
Right. Which is already apparently happening in the United States. We have no idea what's happening in China on that front. At least I don't. But there's some rumblings, I suppose, in China. But the what I would note is what you mentioned earlier, which is that the big box store CEOs are a faction in the United States that would like to maintain the status quo. It has been working well for Amazon and Walmart to have this arrangement, and they are opposed to the change overall. Wouldn't you say?
And also potentially parts of the tech sector. Apple does not seem to have confidence in India as a replacement country for China, and seems reluctant to want to make the necessary shifts that would need to be made, is instead looking to delay and buy time. There are a number of different sectors. The oil sector in the United States also does not like the trade war because any reduction in oil prices will cause the shale oil, which is quite expensive, to be uncompetitive on the global market and potentially result in the closure of a lot of shale oil facilities in the Dakotas. So there are a number of different sectors in the States, and it's clear, we can see relatively clearly in the States which sectors are on which sides. But in China, it becomes harder to know exactly where everybody stands, and you have to watch it very closely. And oftentimes the information that you get is somewhat out of date by the time it actually makes it into English in a way that seems clear and credible. It's often some distance out of date. So we're going to have a hard time doing any kind of real serious China watching. And for that reason, I tend to put most of my focus on what's going on in the United States and look for tells about what might be going on elsewhere on the basis of that.
Michael says that there's plenty of evidence that Trump considers a trade deficit a loss. He describes it as a subsidy or being cheated. When he gives the amount of subsidy cheating, he gives the trade deficit. So I think that's sort of indicating that Trump is some sort of mercantilist and does view the situation in zero-sum terms. But I would just say that his advisors are not mercantilists. They are thinking in terms of productivity rather than like the hoarding of gold or cash, like Scrooge McDuck or something. And that there are times where a trade deficit is not a loss for the United States, and there are times when it is. And I think Trump has a tendency to be hyperbolic and simple in his rhetoric so that he flattens out those distinctions. But what do you think?
But part of what's going on here is a certain level of ambiguity about what it is that would count as a contribution. And this ambiguity is necessary so as to give states a lot of different options. So when you say something like the trade deficit, this allows for states to do things that might not seem to be relevant from the point of view of trade negotiations, like, for instance, buying American weapons. One of the ways in which you can simply shift the math is to buy American weapons. That's a very easy and convenient way to shift the math, and it's something a state can do straightforwardly. There's also, listed on the list of things that you can do that they have given to the other states is the idea that states could just give the United States money. States could just pay the United States. Some of this language is to do with global public goods. This idea that the United States provides global public goods and has charged too little for the provision of these goods, given how much they cost. If you think about it in those terms, then all of a sudden it's a much more open-ended kind of discussion. And the thing is, the administration has been using lots of different kinds of language at different points so as to project an openness to different ways of potentially negotiating on the basis of different kinds of terms or frameworks, because the administration is not rigid about what precisely it wants from particular states, and it's interested in what these states might offer it. So it has tried to keep the door open in terms of what it is that a state could propose. And for that reason, I would try not to get too focused on any particular language that is deployed by anybody at any point. As you mentioned, there are different people in the administration who use different language to discuss this, have different plans, different intentions with regard to where they'd like to see it go. And we've emphasized many of these possibilities. This trade war could result in various different levels of reshoring, various different levels of friendshoring with various different states being the beneficiaries of the friendshoring, and then even escalation to the point of the possibility of a real split in the way that the global trade system works. If there is a persistent inability to get a deal and the sides come to view each other in a worse kind of way. But it should be possible to avoid that, because China does have something to gain from a deal with the United States that would benefit the United States in terms of moving a certain amount of production out of China and to other places in the world. Just as the United States benefited from the initial deal with China in the 70s. The Nixon deal was a deal which moved a certain amount of production ultimately out of the United States over time, and developed China, helped China to get its economy rolling, an economy that had been dealing with a lot of problems prior to that point. And that was nonetheless beneficial to the United States in the sense that it produced an abundance of consumer goods, which in the mid-'80s produced a feeling of significant prosperity, but gradually over a significant temporal window. Something similar could be done for China here. Something similar could happen, but it would require a deal, and that would require a willingness on the part of China to negotiate in better faith than it has to this point. The current strategy works on the premise that the only way to get China to negotiate in bad faith is to subject it to stress. The only way to get it to negotiate in good faith is to subject it to stress. If that's true, then eventually China will negotiate in good faith. If it's not true, it could lead to escalation.
And that, as you said earlier, that view of China is bipartisan. That is not just the Trump view. That is the Washington consensus view.
That's what Hillary Clinton thinks. Hillary Clinton said that, in her view, we've tried negotiating with China, competing with China under fair terms of cooperation. China doesn't play fair. And she said, quote, "We have to take back the means of production." There's a clip of Hillary Clinton saying that you can find online.
So Michael says, these politicians only care about making their donors rich at the working man's expense. They shipped these jobs to Mexico and left our communities with nothing. I would just counter that by saying these politicians want to make their donors rich, certainly, but they also want to get reelected, and they want the society to function well enough to maintain their governing ability. They can't have the society completely fall apart. So they'll make a calculation about which communities they can sacrifice without, undermining their own authority or their donors' ability to continue to make massive profits. And they'll leave communities in the dust with nothing. But they do that in a calculated, strategic way. And there are parts of the economy that they can't just decimate. And then actually now, it looks like they have to go back on some of their earlier decisions to rebuild some industrial base in the United States in order to maintain their power in the world and the authority even in the United States. But am I going too far there?
Prosperity relies on peace, so they have to be interested in security. Whether they're focusing on the prosperity of voters or the prosperity of donors and elites, maintaining prosperity requires maintaining security. And therefore, the geostrategic questions about security are relevant to them.
Michael's saying now, oh my God, Doug, no. Doug, no. I have no idea why. What do you think I said that was so off the rails there? Any idea? Can you read his mind?
Can't guess. I can't read people's minds.
Spencer Leonard says, I think Ben should be much more careful about what helps or hurts China or the U.S. And I guess what he's pointing to there is that these national interests are not as opposed as they might appear, and that
I'm talking about states. So of course there is a potential deal that could be reached between the Chinese state and the American state that could be mutually beneficial for both states. There is, of course, a deal, but such a deal would require a capacity on the part of both of those states to get their factions in line behind those deals. And so there's a question about internal cohesion from the point of view of these states. Can they actually get the rebellious factions that want to preserve the present arrangement to support the kind of deal that they need? Or will these factions manage to, both by petitioning the particular politicians on golf trips and by generating a negative media environment, prevent these states from coming together and making a deal that is satisfactory to both of them?
All right, and Spencer Leonard just says, politicians represent communities of global society, not just communities within the national framework.
I'm not really talking about nations here. I'm not really talking about the concept of nationalism. I'm just talking about states right now. States that are negotiating and have to deal with different kinds of forces, social forces, that they are looking to coordinate or manage. I'm not conceding anything to any kind of nationalist ontology here when I talk about states. I'm just talking about states. I'm not claiming that they legitimately represent any national, ethnic, anything. I'm not implying that. There's no normative endorsement implicit in that language. We have to be able to talk about states, though, and what states are doing and how states view themselves.
Oh, I have some clarification from the chat about why Michael was so upset. It says Michael thinks that Doug, you're presenting it as his opinion, where he's responding it to me. And I would just say to everybody in the chat, if you don't want to be misrepresented that way, don't talk to each other. Watch your fucking show, and ask questions to the people on the screen. Don't argue with each other. It's confusing, and you're wasting. You could do that anywhere else. We're doing something here. Okay. So let's see. To move on, let's talk about AI. And I mean, look, obviously, I'm simple-minded when it comes to this debate between you and Spencer about global communities or national interests. Obviously, there are nations. The politicians in these nations tell the story of national interests. They have to answer to the local or national bourgeoisie who are their donors. But they also have to operate on a global scale, and so do a good portion of the CEOs and capitalists within their country. So it's not a simple matter of simply like representing U.S. interests alone, or Chinese interests alone. But on the other hand, these sorts of interests do come up. There are interests that each nation would have in as labor is divided up and in
Yeah.
the global economy.
The way I would think about this is that these states have interests. And one of the things that you're looking to do if you are in American society or Chinese society is to get your interests to be taken to be those of the state. So you're trying to convince the state actors, in some cases, that they should care about your interests. Well, why should they care about your interests? Because you will support them if they act in accordance with your interests, or because perhaps you will harm them if they do not. So there's an attempt to get the state to take your interests as its interests. And that's an attempt that is always fraught, because there are many different players with potentially conflicting interests who also want the state to take their interests to be its interests. And so there are a variety of different ways of trying to apply pressure or to persuade or to convince state actors that they ought to act in accordance with some particular factional or sectoral interest. I am generally very reluctant to regard any factional or sectoral or class interest as the interest of a nation or the interest of a whole people. I am very reluctant to ever use language like that.
Right.
So I will tend to talk about states and what states are taking their interests to be, and the different factions and sectors and potentially classes, in cases where we get to such a point that it's relevant, that are in play, that are impacting the state's understanding of what is in its interests. And that understanding comes through the mediation of the parties. It comes through the mediation that produces the particular political actors, the elections, all of the procedures that adjudicate offices. All of these things are relevant for determining how do political actors think about what they have to do to maintain and build their position.
Right. So Spencer Leonard says socialist politics is entirely predicated on the possibility of acting politically without having your interests coordinated to those of the state.
We're not in socialism. We're talking about a particular situation that is occurring in capitalism. We're trying to understand something that's occurring in capitalism. We are not in socialism. We don't have anything like socialist relations at present.
Yeah, right. So when we're describing what the Trump administration is doing or what the Chinese state is doing, we're not suggesting that that this is no endorsement, nor does it fully describe our own aims for a future kind of politics.
Yeah, when I say China or the United States in these contexts, I'm just talking about states. I'm not implying that you're part of any of it or that you benefit from any of it. Not at all. I don't feel that I'm part of any of it or that I benefit from any of it. I'm not normatively endorsing anybody. I'm just talking about these states and how these states are trying to see if they can make a deal. And if they can't make a deal, then see what they have to do.
All right, so here's one more round with Spencer Leonard, and then we'll move on from this. Capitalist politics must come to terms with society at large, not only how it is coordinated to the state. Oops. There, take that off the screen.
This requires a particular ontology for understanding politics that you would have to take as a given as part of having this discussion. The way that I tend to approach things is through the particular sectoral interests that seem to exist. If these things are coordinated or add up in such a way that we could talk about society as something which has existence in the present moment, that's a deep ontological question that I think I can't operate on the basis of premises about.
I have a belief myself that society exists. I've spotted it. I also know people who've seen UFOs, but I've spotted society, I think, in a much more tangible and direct way. So I do believe in society. But let's look, but just working out exactly how states balance their own sectoral interests and the brackets that are going on, and with the
Well, I think
interests of society.
sometimes when we insist on a notion of society in a case where there's serious intra-elite conflict that's taking place, this can cause us to miss the character of that conflict. If we assume that there is an American national interest, an American society which has a common interest taken as a whole, and we operate from that premise, we might miss some of the significant factional divisions that are taking place at any given time. I don't think it's always helpful to center or emphasize that language, especially when we are dealing with a lot of factionalism.
Spencer wants to go beyond that and say not only is there a U.S. society that has its own interest, but there's a global society. There's a general will of the whole global population.
Then at this point, we have a very low bar for what would constitute a society. And one of the things that you sometimes see is a certain Mott and Bailey going around with the concept of society. Sometimes people use society to imply something which could be politically represented, and other times they'll use society to describe just an instance in which there's trade and commerce occurring. That doesn't mean that that trade or commerce can rise to a level of political representation in a way that can be legitimated, in a way that can be functional. There are major questions about whether there is such a thing as a global society which can be politically represented. These are deep questions in the IR literature. We could go into this, but we're talking about an applied situation, which is the trade war.
At this point, I feel like I can get something out of the analysis you provided, Ben, of what's going on with China and the United States, and try to understand what's likely to occur. But what I can't do, even after listening to you and Spencer exchange your views on a kind of deeper political theory question, is determine to what degree do I have to embrace your ontology or be as skeptical as you are of this notion that Spencer Leonard is raising of a global society, a general will, that I believe he's raising in order to believe what you're saying enough to take it seriously and as informing my understanding of the future that might emerge from this trade war, for example. So I'm not quite there.
We could have a discussion about ontology, and I would be happy to have a discussion about, am I too much of a Hobbesian? Is Spencer being too much of a Rousseauian? We could have that kind of conversation, but it would be a different kind of conversation from the one that we began with.
Right. I concur. So, all right. So listen, we've got about 13 minutes left. Let's briefly just touch upon the question of AI. It came up over the last week in the various after party conversations around the podcast. People discussed it at such length that at one point one of the patrons described the whole conversation as verbal diarrhea, having grown fed up with the question of, are these LLMs on the verge of developing what passes for consciousness based on whatever philosophy of mind you might have, or will the singularity arrive, or is it just a scam? But maybe next time Spencer Leonard comes on, by the way, he says he'll come on as often as he can, or as much as he can, which means as often as I'll let him, maybe. We should maybe put you on with Spencer to discuss this very question of the political ontology. But what I want to know is what your attitude is about AI. How significant is AI as a piece of the puzzle in the trade war? And what do we have to think about AI in order for us to take it as a serious concern as we try to evaluate what's happening in the world?
So I think insofar as it matters in relation to defense. So in the defense sector, there is a significant take-up of this kind of technology to do specific kinds of tasks, like auto-targeting, like giving you a capacity for maybe one fighter jet to command an enormous number of drones with a kind of mobile command center that would have a proximity. So it would make it difficult to hack because the drones would be tied into the mobile command center. Mm-hmm. So there's significant uptake of some of this stuff in defense. That matters because the technology and then the raw materials and manufacturing that you need to support that technology, that becomes something that states want to have in territory that they control. So for that reason, there is going to be a certain amount of wrangling about getting industries related to that kind of defense production located in the United States or in territories that the United States is very confident it has significant influence over. Some of this other stuff is really in the terrain of large language models, where we're just talking about chatbots and machines that paint pictures for memesters and stuff like that. This kind of stuff doesn't make decisions of the kind that the technology that's being designed by a company like, say, Anduril is potentially capable of doing. It doesn't make life or death choices about who to kill. It is really therefore operating in a very different space, which is more to do with, are there certain kinds of jobs that are vulnerable to that kind of technology? And then also, do we have some people in our society who can't tell the difference between a large language model and a person? And how that confusion, that inability to tell the difference, could potentially result in many people getting very badly hurt and abused in the near future. I recently heard Mark Zuckerberg in an interview say that right now, the average American has 3 friends, but has demand for 15, and that Americans who have access to these chatbots will have a higher level of satisfaction, not because these chatbots are human friends, but because they can perform some of the functions which human friends perform. And that therefore there will be a statistical correlation potentially between interacting with these chatbots and human well-being measured in some way. And he said, we don't yet have the vocabulary to show this and convince people of this. And what I took this to mean is that he has not yet paid desperate academics and researchers enough money to get them to go and produce the theory and then also the quantitative empirical studies establishing that lonely people who talk to chatbots feel better and have higher well-being or welfare or happiness in some sense, defined in some way. But of course, it's possible to produce that research. And then once that research is produced, there will be this ostensibly objective basis for these chatbots. And if you continue to oppose them, then you will be accused of rejecting the difference, rejecting the people who have chosen for various reasons to do with their lifestyle or desires or personal taste to have relationships with these chatbots. You're rejecting the real value that they report they get from interacting with these chatbots. And how can you do this? Aren't you just being intolerant and illiberal by having these attitudes? Surely he will be able to get academics to produce arguments that will have this effect. And so eventually it will come to be that not only is it not unreasonable to welcome the chatbots, but if you don't welcome the chatbots, you will be framed as a reactionary conservative person.
Yeah, well, they're the new part of the LGBTQ RST community will be those who fall in love with their AI boyfriend, girlfriend, or non-binary platonic imaginary friend. Oh, not platonic. We already seen this movie. It's called Her, and stars Joaquin Phoenix and directed by Spike Jonze. I think this is a good segue into the short story for the week, which was Walter Kern's Finishing. I also want to say before I do that, that Spencer is welcome to join the after party, and everyone should join the after party on Patreon. Go over there, sign up. It helps us continue, and we've got the Sublation magazine going now. We need to expand our financial base, so your support and participation is needed. But Walter Kern's short story Finishing seems to me to be timely in terms of Zuckerberg's announcement rather than maybe the trade war overall. What did you make of the story? Which, by the way, just to summarize it briefly, it's about a teenage boy who loses his job dispensing ice cream to tourists and children to a very elaborate and fancy lobster-like automatic AI ice cream machine, and the comic ways in which he tries to defeat the machine and fails. So what did you make of it?
Yeah, I thought that was a good and interesting story. The poor guy, he is clearly trying to get his life together and help. There's a single mom that he's trying to help. He's trying to do things that are socially good and necessary. Other people have left, but he's stayed behind to try to help this mother because he cares about the development of her child. And yet, the fact that there's a social need for him to have enough money to be able to do these things makes no difference, of course, for his boss, who is only interested in whether he can actually do the work. So he has this demand for labor. He needs a job. There is no other way in his present society for him to be able to do the things he's looking to do. And yet, because of the development of the technology, this social problem cannot be solved. And there's an experiment in the story where he tries to apply the techniques of dating suggested to him by online influencers. Yeah, these manfluencers and red pill type people. He tries this pickup artist kind of routine on his boss, trying to circumvent his inability to serve her economically by instead attempting to establish a romantic relationship, which might make him indispensable for her.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, he is replaced by a robot in this field as well.
That's right. Yeah.
And so the whole problem is replicated again on another level, which I think is wonderful. This problem does get repeatedly replicated on additional levels. And each time there is a creative attempt by people to find a way to still be useful in the face of this. And then what happens, insofar as they're able to succeed for a time, it's only temporary, it's only fleeting, because the same thing will then happen in whatever new set of enclaves they go hide in.
Mm-hmm. When we were discussing this short story in the writer's workshop yesterday, it spurred on a confession of types from one of the participants who said that he doesn't like it when the robot is taken out of its box and introduced into the romantic encounters that he's been a part of, and it's felt overwhelmed in such scenarios. I think that the sufficiently new age progressive man will simply accept the necessity of vibrating accessories in going forward, but maybe not accept these damn lobster ice cream machines taking over our jobs. What is your opinion actually of the gender dynamic of the short story and the way in which the workers represented as an incel in a way? What did you make of that?
One thing I've noticed is that when older men write stories about younger men, the way into the consciousness of younger men is romance, dating, sexuality. That's the thing that the older man and the younger man potentially share, a sexual orientation. And so this is often a way to try to cut across other divisions that the older author might be conscious they might not be able to deal with. The older author might not be able to give a full account of Gen Alpha or Gen Z culture, might not be sufficiently in touch with young people to do that in a way that would be convincing. But by talking about romance, dating, and sexuality, may be able to nonetheless approach it near enough that it's sufficiently convincing.
Now, you're not a Zoomer, but a younger millennial. But how convincing was this Gen X account or Boomer account? I'm not sure.
It sounded reasonable to me, but I'm older than the 18-year-old. Right. So it worked for me. I wonder, and I think it would be an interesting thing to hear to what degree 18-year-olds would, if 18-year-olds still read.
Well, I interviewed Walter Kern over the weekend. People should look forward on Thursday for that interview to drop. I'm hoping that it's the beginning of a beautiful friendship with Walter Kern. I admire him greatly. He is the kind of fiction writer that I set out to become when I first began writing fiction, so I admire him greatly. And he's willing to put up with my pet obsession with the JFK assassination, which he shares since we're in the same demographic. So people can look forward to hearing about that. Listen, I'm going to end the stream here, and people can join us over on Patreon in the after party conversation on Zoom. I do encourage Spencer Leonard to join us there if he has the time. Ashley should join if she has the time. She's been in the chat. Steve Roberts, please come and see us over there. And yeah, thanks everyone for watching. It turns out people did watch. I was wrong at the start to get all panicky. All right. See you over there.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as